The most expensive mistake my HOA ever made was believing a dock was free just because they had been using it for years. The marina looked wrong that morning. I noticed it before I even stepped out of my truck. The sun was just beginning to rise over the water, painting the lake in shades of gold and orange, and for the first time in decades, several of the largest boat slips along the South Pier sat completely empty. The water rocked gently against the pilings. Seagulls circled overhead. A cool breeze carried the familiar scent of salt, fuel, and weathered wood across the docks. Normally, those slips were occupied by luxury yachts worth millions of dollars. They had become such a permanent part of the landscape that most residents probably could not imagine the marina without them. But on that particular morning, the empty spaces were impossible to ignore. A crowd had already gathered near the waterfront. Residents stood along the boardwalk holding coffee cups, whispering to one another while staring toward the vacant slips. Some looked confused. Others looked angry. A few simply looked stunned. Near the end of the dock, a sheriff's vehicle sat parked beside several marina service trucks. The flashing lights were off. Everything was calm, professional, quiet. Yet the atmosphere felt heavier than any storm I could remember. Then I saw Patricia Monroe. She was moving quickly down the boardwalk, her expensive jacket fluttering in the wind as she pushed through groups of residents. Her expression shifted between disbelief and frustration as she stared at the empty marina spaces. Every few seconds, she looked from the water to the sheriff's vehicle and back again, as though reality might somehow change if she checked enough times. It did not. The slips remained empty. The yachts were gone. Around her, members of the HOA board looked equally shocked. Some were checking phones. Others were arguing quietly among themselves. Nobody seemed to know exactly what to say. The answer was simple, but none of them wanted to admit it. Those empty slips represented $750,000. They represented years of warnings, years of engineering reports, years of invoices, years of letters that had been ignored. I leaned against the railing overlooking the marina and watched the sunlight spread across the water. The surface glimmered like polished glass. Beyond the harbor entrance, the lake stretched toward the horizon. It should have been a peaceful morning. In many ways, it was. For me, at least. Because unlike everyone else standing on that dock, I knew exactly how this story had reached this point. I knew why the slips were empty. I knew why the sheriff was present. I knew why the yacht owners were suddenly demanding answers from the HOA. Most importantly, I knew this had not happened overnight. The events of that morning had started years earlier with a belief that seemed harmless at first. Patricia Monroe believed the marina belonged to the community simply because the community used it. She repeated that belief so often that eventually other people started repeating it too. What nobody realized was that water remembers every unpaid bill. Infrastructure remembers every ignored warning. And eventually, the paperwork catches up with everyone. Standing there in the cold morning air, listening to the waves tap softly against the docks, I watched Patricia stare at the empty slips and finally begin to understand what $750,000 worth of ignored responsibility actually looked like. My name is Logan Mercer, and long before the marina became valuable, it was simply where my father spent his mornings. When people talk about Mercer Marina today, they usually focus on the numbers, the waterfront property values, the yacht traffic, the waiting lists for boat slips, the annual revenue. They see polished docks, expensive vessels, and waterfront homes worth millions of dollars. What they do not see are the decades that came before any of it existed. I grew up on that shoreline. Some of my earliest memories involve following my father across unfinished wooden docks while he carried tools larger than my arms could lift. Back then, there were no luxury yachts, no waterfront mansions, no homeowners association, just a stretch of shoreline, a few fishing boats, and a man who believed the lake would eventually become something special. Every board, piling, and utility line had a story attached to it. My father built the first slips himself. He drove pilings into the lake bed during scorching summers and freezing winters. He repaired storm damage with his own hands. He spent years creating a marina that people could depend on. Whenever something broke, he fixed it. Whenever something needed improvement, he found a way to pay for it. He used to tell me that waterfront infrastructure was different from most businesses because failure did not happen all at once. It happened slowly. One neglected repair led to another. One ignored maintenance issue created three more. If you stopped paying attention, The water would eventually expose every shortcut you ever took. At the time, I thought he was talking about docks. Years later, I realized he was talking about people too. By the time ownership passed to me, the marina had become one of the most recognizable properties on the lake. Hundreds of vessels moved through our slips every year. Families spent weekends on the water. Business owners docked their boats along the main pier. Tourists rented temporary space throughout the season. The marina became part of the local identity. That success came with responsibility. Every year, I invested heavily in inspections, repairs, electrical upgrades, safety improvements, and structural maintenance. Most visitors never noticed those things. They saw calm water and beautiful boats. I saw electrical systems hidden beneath docks, fuel infrastructure, utility connections, load-bearing pilings, the invisible systems that kept everything functioning safely. That was why the situation with the HOA frustrated me so much. They viewed the marina as a convenience. I viewed it as infrastructure. There is a difference. Convenience feels free. Infrastructure costs money every single day. Standing on the boardwalk that morning, watching residents stare at the empty slips, I thought about my father. He would have understood exactly what was happening. The yachts had disappeared because years of responsibility had finally collided with years of denial. Most of the people gathered around the docks only saw the result. They did not see the inspections. They did not see the engineering reports. They did not see the invoices sitting inside filing cabinets. They certainly did not see the countless meetings that came before any of this happened. The marina looked peaceful beneath the rising sun. Waves rolled gently against the docks. The empty slips reflected golden light across the water. To everyone else, it looked like something had suddenly gone wrong. To me, it looked like the final chapter of a story that had been building for a very long time. The first time I met Patricia Monroe, she arrived at the marina carrying a notebook and a smile. If you only saw her during those first few months, you probably would have liked her. Most people did. She knew how to make people feel heard. She remembered names. She attended community events. She volunteered for local committees. When she eventually became HOA president, almost nobody objected. At first, neither did I. The waterfront community was growing rapidly, and strong leadership seemed like a good thing. The problem was not that Patricia wanted to help. The problem was that she slowly stopped recognizing where her authority ended. It began with small assumptions. She would refer to the marina as a neighborhood asset during community meetings. Then she started describing the docks as a shared resource. Residents repeated the phrases because they sounded reasonable. After all, many homeowners kept boats there. Many families used the waterfront regularly. The marina had become woven into daily life around the lake. What most people forgot was a simple fact. Familiarity does not create ownership. Yet Patricia kept pushing the idea further. During HOA meetings, she spoke about future waterfront improvements as though she had some role in managing them. During community gatherings, she discussed marina access as though it were a benefit provided by the HOA. Every statement was subtle. Every implication carefully worded. She rarely made claims that could be challenged directly. Instead, she planted assumptions. Assumptions grow quickly when nobody questions them. Over time, those assumptions became part of the community culture. I started noticing changes in the way residents talked about the property. New homeowners often arrived believing the marina belonged to the neighborhood. Some assumed their HOA dues covered marina operations. Others believed access rights existed automatically because they purchased homes nearby. None of those things were true. Yet correcting people became increasingly difficult because the misinformation was no longer coming from one conversation. It was coming from hundreds of conversations. The story had taken on a life of its own. Then came the waterfront expansion discussions. Property values were rising. Larger yachts were appearing every season. Slip demand reached record levels. During one HOA board meeting, Patricia publicly suggested that marina improvements should be considered a community responsibility because the entire neighborhood benefited from them. Several residents applauded. Others nodded. I sat quietly listening. The statement sounded cooperative on the surface, but it revealed something deeper. Patricia no longer viewed the marina as a private business. She viewed it as an extension of HOA influence. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. As years passed, she became increasingly comfortable speaking on behalf of infrastructure she did not own. If a resident had concerns about docking policies, Patricia often responded before marina staff could. If questions arose regarding future improvements, she offered opinions that sounded suspiciously like decisions. The confidence with which she spoke made many people assume authority existed. Confidence can be persuasive. Paperwork is less exciting. Unfortunately for Patricia, paperwork is what matters. Looking back now, standing on the boardwalk while residents stared at those empty slips, I can see exactly how the problem developed. It was never really about yachts. It was never really about money. It was about perception. Patricia spent years turning access into entitlement. She spent years convincing people that proximity created rights. Eventually, she believed it herself. And once someone starts confusing influence with ownership, the consequences become only a matter of time. The first warning arrived during a routine structural inspection. At the time, nobody thought it would become the beginning of a $750,000 dispute. It was late spring. The lake was crowded with boats returning after winter storage, and the marina was entering its busiest season. The docks looked beautiful from a distance. Fresh paint, clean walkways, calm water reflecting sunlight across the harbor. Most visitors saw a thriving waterfront destination. The engineers saw something very different. I remember standing beside them as they moved slowly along the south pier, taking measurements and photographs. The smell of lake water mixed with diesel fuel from nearby vessels. Waves bumped gently against the pilings below. Every few minutes, one of the engineers would stop, make notes, and continue walking. Their expressions grew more serious with every section they inspected. A week later, the report arrived. The findings were impossible to ignore. Years of heavy use had accelerated deterioration throughout several high-capacity slips. Support pilings showed significant wear. Electrical systems required upgrades. Utility infrastructure needed modernization. Load-bearing components servicing larger vessels were approaching replacement thresholds. None of the problems were unusual for a marina handling that volume of traffic. The issue was scale. Repairs would be expensive, very expensive. Over the following months, additional inspections confirmed the same conclusions. Independent engineers reviewed the findings. Marine contractors submitted estimates. Financial analysts evaluated long-term costs. Every report pointed toward the same reality. Delaying repairs would only make the situation worse. Waterfront infrastructure does not reward procrastination. Water has a way of exposing weaknesses faster than most people expect. So I approved the work. Crews began replacing critical components. Utility systems were upgraded. Structural reinforcements were installed. Specialized contractors spent months rebuilding sections of the marina that most residents never even noticed. Construction equipment became a common sight along the docks. Some mornings, the sound of machinery echoed across the harbor before sunrise. Throughout the process, one fact remained consistent. The majority of wear was associated with the largest vessels occupying the most heavily used slips. Those slips happened to be used primarily by residents connected to the HOA waterfront community. That fact mattered because maintenance responsibility had never been a mystery. Usage agreements, access contracts, infrastructure provisions. Everything had been documented for years. The paperwork existed long before Patricia became HOA president. Long before most residents moved into the neighborhood. The obligations were clear. Yet every time the subject came up, Patricia treated it as a future discussion rather than a present responsibility. During meetings, she often redirected attention toward amenities, events, and community projects. Infrastructure was less exciting. Nobody applauds electrical upgrades. Nobody celebrates reinforced pilings. Nobody takes photographs beside repaired utility systems. The problem is that those invisible systems keep everything else functioning. By the time the final engineering review was completed, the numbers were staggering. $750,000. That figure represented years of accumulated maintenance, repairs, replacements, inspections, and infrastructure improvements. It was not a penalty. It was not a surprise charge. It was simply the cost of preserving the marina that hundreds of people depended on. Standing on the boardwalk months later, watching residents stare at those empty slips, I thought back to the day I first opened that engineering report. The warnings had been clear. The responsibilities had been documented. The damage had been measured. Every opportunity to address the problem had existed. The only thing missing was the willingness to accept what the paperwork had been saying all along. The invoice was delivered on a Tuesday morning. I remember the date because my accountant called less than an hour later and asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to send it. $750,000 is not a number people ignore easily. It gets attention the moment it appears on paper. By then, however, the calculations had been reviewed repeatedly. Engineers had signed off on the reports. Contractors had documented the repairs. Attorneys had verified the agreements. Every figure had been checked, cross-checked, and verified again. The invoice was not a negotiation tactic. It was simply the final accounting of costs that already existed. We mailed physical copies. We emailed digital copies. We sent supporting documentation thick enough to fill an entire binder. Inspection reports, maintenance records, infrastructure assessments, usage agreements. Every page told the same story. The marina had incurred substantial expenses maintaining systems heavily utilized by vessels associated with the waterfront HOA community. A week later, Patricia requested a meeting. The HOA boardroom overlooked the lake through large windows. Afternoon sunlight reflected off the water while residents filled most of the seats. I arrived carrying 2 binders. Patricia arrived carrying confidence. The difference would become important later. As the meeting began, I walked everyone through the documentation. I explained the inspection findings. I reviewed the contractor reports. I outlined the repair timeline and associated costs. The presentation lasted nearly 40 minutes. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged the numbers. Nobody disputed the engineering conclusions. For a brief moment, I thought the process might actually remain professional. Then Patricia stood up. She thanked me for the presentation. She complimented the quality of the reports. Then she smiled and announced that the HOA would not be paying. The room became strangely quiet. I asked whether she disagreed with the documentation. She said no. I asked whether she disputed the repairs. Again, no. I asked whether she believed the costs were inaccurate. Once more, no. Her explanation was remarkably simple. The HOA did not want to pay. Several board members nodded. A few residents even laughed softly, as though the situation were somehow amusing. Patricia went further. She described the invoice as unrealistic. She suggested the marina should absorb the expense because waterfront improvements benefited everyone. Then she made the statement that would eventually cost the HOA far more than money. She said the marina needed the community more than the community needed the marina. The words lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. I remember looking around the table at the faces of board members who seemed completely convinced they had won something. In reality, they had just rejected the easiest solution they would ever receive. Over the following weeks, additional correspondence was exchanged. Attorneys communicated. Accountants reviewed figures. Opportunities for resolution remained available. Every response from the HOA followed the same pattern. Delay. Dismiss. Deny. Patricia treated the issue as though persistence alone would make it disappear. Unfortunately for her, infrastructure does not operate on optimism. Contracts do not respond to wishful thinking. The obligations remained exactly where they had always been. Months later, standing on the boardwalk and looking at the empty slips, I could still hear Patricia's voice from that meeting. The marina needs the community more than the community needs the marina. At the time, several people applauded. Looking back, it was probably the most expensive applause I have ever witnessed. The warnings continued for nearly 6 months. Looking back, that was probably the most frustrating part of the entire situation. People often imagine disputes like this exploding into existence overnight. The reality is usually much slower, much quieter. Most conflicts are given countless opportunities to end peacefully before they ever reach a breaking point. This one was no different. After the invoice was rejected, my attorneys prepared a formal response. The letter was professional, detailed, and direct. It outlined the contractual obligations associated with marina access. It referenced the engineering reports. It included payment options. Most importantly, it explained the consequences of continued noncompliance. Nobody could claim they were surprised. Weeks passed. No payment arrived. Instead, another letter appeared from the HOA. Patricia insisted the community should not be responsible for infrastructure costs she believed benefited the entire waterfront. Her position had not changed. Neither had the paperwork. We responded again. Additional documentation was provided. More records were shared. Another opportunity for resolution was offered. Again, nothing happened. Summer arrived. The marina became crowded with boat traffic. Families loaded coolers onto vessels. Children carried fishing poles down the docks. Vacationers rented slips for holiday weekends. From the outside, everything looked normal. Beneath the surface, however, attorneys continued exchanging correspondence. Every few weeks another deadline passed. Every few weeks another warning was ignored. During one particularly memorable HOA meeting, I attended in person to answer questions from residents. The room was packed. Ceiling fans spun slowly overhead, while evening sunlight streamed through tall windows overlooking the lake. I brought binders containing every relevant document. Several homeowners approached me beforehand and privately admitted they were concerned. They wanted the issue resolved. They understood the obligations. They simply assumed the HOA board was handling it. Unfortunately, the board was doing the opposite. Patricia opened the meeting by assuring everyone there was nothing to worry about. She described the dispute as a disagreement rather than a legal issue. She implied the marina would eventually compromise. Then she suggested that enforcement would be impossible because removing access to the slips would disrupt too many residents. That statement drew applause. I remember sitting quietly while the room filled with confidence. The strange thing about confidence is that it often sounds convincing right before reality arrives. By early fall, the attorneys stopped discussing voluntary solutions and began discussing enforcement procedures. County officials reviewed the agreements. Access provisions were examined. Usage rights were analyzed. Every review reached the same conclusion. The marina retained the authority to revoke access for noncompliance. The documentation supporting that authority had existed for years. Patricia was notified. The HOA board was notified. Individual vessel owners were notified. Certified letters arrived. Electronic notices were delivered. Deadlines were extended. Additional time was granted. Yet the response never changed. Delay. Dismiss. Deny. By then, I had stopped feeling frustrated. Frustration requires uncertainty. There was no uncertainty left. The facts were settled. The only remaining question was whether the HOA would acknowledge them before enforcement began. Standing on the boardwalk months later, watching residents gather around those empty slips, I thought about every letter, every meeting, and every warning that had led to that morning. None of what happened was sudden. None of it was unexpected. The outcome had been sitting in writing for months. The only surprise was how long Patricia managed to convince people that paperwork could be ignored without consequences. The final notice was delivered on a Monday afternoon. By then, the process had moved far beyond arguments and opinions. Everything was operating according to procedures that had been documented long before any of the current HOA board members held office. County officials had completed their reviews. Attorneys had finalized the filings. Marina management had exhausted every available opportunity for voluntary compliance. The next phase would not involve debate. It would involve execution. I remember sitting in my office overlooking the harbor when the confirmation call arrived. Through the window, dozens of vessels rocked gently against their moorings beneath clear autumn skies. The marina looked exactly as it always had. Calm, orderly, peaceful. Yet I knew that within a matter of days, one of the largest enforcement actions in the marina's history would begin. The county representative spoke clearly and professionally. All requirements had been satisfied. All notifications had been acknowledged. Access revocation procedures could proceed according to the agreements governing slip usage. When the call ended, I simply placed the phone down and looked out across the water. There was no excitement, no sense of victory, just certainty. The outcome had become inevitable months earlier. That evening, additional notices were distributed to vessel owners occupying the affected slips. Every communication explained the situation in precise detail. Deadlines, responsibilities, available remedies, contact information. Nobody could reasonably claim ignorance. The documentation was overwhelming. Yet the response from Patricia remained remarkably consistent. During a community meeting later that week, she assured residents that nothing significant would happen. She suggested the marina was attempting to pressure the HOA into negotiations. She implied enforcement would be delayed. She hinted that legal complications would prevent meaningful action. Several homeowners appeared relieved after hearing her speak. Others looked unconvinced. A few had already started consulting attorneys of their own. They sensed what Patricia refused to acknowledge. The paperwork was no longer moving toward a consequence. It had already arrived there. As the week progressed, Preparations continued quietly. Specialized marine contractors coordinated schedules. County personnel reviewed logistics. Marina staff documented slip assignments and vessel records. Everything was handled professionally and methodically. Most residents never noticed. They continued walking the boardwalk. They continued hosting waterfront gatherings. They continued treating the marina as though nothing had changed. Meanwhile, the legal machinery kept moving forward one step at a time. The night before enforcement began, I walked the docks alone. The air carried the familiar scent of lake water and fuel. Reflections from dock lights shimmered across the dark surface below. Expensive yachts rested motionless within their slips. Some stretched over 60 feet long. Others featured multiple decks, polished railings, and luxury cabins. They looked impressive beneath the evening lights. Looking at them, I could not help thinking about how much effort had been invested trying to prevent what was about to happen. Meetings, reports, letters, deadlines, extensions. Every opportunity had existed. The owners of those vessels were not standing on the edge of a surprise. They were standing at the end of a process. Early the next morning, county officials, marine contractors, and sheriff personnel would arrive at the marina. Patricia still believed the situation would somehow resolve itself at the last moment. She still believed confidence could overcome contracts. As I stood there listening to gentle waves tap against the pilings, I realized something she never understood. Infrastructure does not care about popularity. Water does not care about speeches. Agreements do not care about assumptions. Eventually, every obligation reaches its due date. And dawn was only a few hours away. The marina was already awake when I arrived before sunrise. A thin layer of mist drifted across the water while dock lights cast long reflections over the harbor. The sky remained dark blue along the horizon, but the first traces of morning were beginning to appear. The air felt cool and still. Even the usual sounds seemed quieter than normal. The entire waterfront carried the strange feeling that accompanies important moments before they happen. County vehicles arrived first, then the marine contractors. Shortly afterward, sheriff personnel entered the marina through the main access road. Everything occurred exactly according to schedule. No sirens, no urgency, no drama. Just professionals performing responsibilities that had been planned weeks in advance. I stood near the harbor office watching the operation begin. The scent of lake water mixed with fresh coffee from a nearby marina employee. Seagulls called from somewhere beyond the docks. The calmness of the morning contrasted sharply with the tension that would arrive only minutes later. Word spreads quickly in waterfront communities. By the time the first contractor reached the South Pier, residents had already started gathering along the boardwalk. Some arrived wearing jackets over pajamas. Others carried coffee cups. Several yacht owners stood staring toward their vessels with expressions that shifted from confusion to concern. Then Patricia appeared. I noticed her immediately because she was moving much faster than anyone else. She stepped onto the boardwalk looking from one official vehicle to another before finally spotting the sheriff personnel near the marina entrance. The confidence she normally carried seemed absent. For the first time since the dispute began, she looked uncertain. A county representative approached several vessel owners and calmly explained the situation. Documentation was available for review. Notices had been delivered. Deadlines had expired. Access rights associated with the affected slips had been revoked according to existing agreements. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The facts spoke for themselves. One by one, marine contractors began preparing vessels for relocation. The process was careful and methodical. Lines were inspected. Equipment was checked. Safety procedures were followed. Large yachts that had occupied the same slips for years slowly began leaving their positions. Watching those empty spaces emerge felt surreal. Residents gathered along the waterfront railings. Conversations spread through the crowd. Some homeowners looked frustrated. Others looked shocked. A few simply stared in silence. The reality of the situation had finally become visible. Paperwork that had existed inside binders and legal files for months was now taking physical form right in front of them. Patricia approached the county representative carrying a folder of her own. I could not hear the entire conversation from where I stood, but I recognized the expression on her face. It was the expression people wear when they discover that confidence and authority are not the same thing. For months, she had promised residents that meaningful enforcement would never occur. Now dozens of witnesses were watching it happen in real time. As the sun finally rose above the lake, golden lights spread across the water. The mist slowly disappeared. Empty slips reflected the morning sky where luxury yachts had rested only hours earlier. The crowd remained gathered along the boardwalk, watching the scene unfold. Nobody seemed interested in speeches anymore. Nobody wanted explanations. The facts were sitting right there in front of them. Standing beside the harbor office, I looked across the marina and realized something. The most powerful moment was not seeing the yachts leave. It was watching people finally understand that every warning, every notice, every deadline, and every document had been real all along. 6 months later, the marina looked healthier than it had in years. Winter had arrived, bringing crisp air, clear skies, and quiet mornings across the waterfront. The repairs were complete. The upgraded systems were functioning perfectly. New pilings stood beneath reinforced docks. Electrical infrastructure had been modernized. Utility lines operated more efficiently than ever. Most visitors never noticed any of it. They arrived, stepped onto the boardwalk, admired the water, and continued with their day. That was the strange thing about infrastructure. When it works properly, people rarely think about it at all. The community, however, had changed. The events of that autumn morning lingered far longer than anyone expected. Residents who once accepted assumptions without question had become far more interested in facts. HOA meetings drew larger crowds. Financial reports received closer attention. Questions that had once gone unasked were suddenly being asked every month. Accountability had become important again. Patricia Monroe remained in the neighborhood, but her influence never fully recovered. The confidence that once filled every room she entered had gradually faded. Several board members chose not to seek re-election. New leadership emerged with a very different approach. They focused less on appearances and more on documentation, less on promises and more on responsibilities. The shift was noticeable almost immediately. For the first time in years, discussions between the marina and the HOA felt productive, professional, grounded in reality. One afternoon in early December, I attended a community meeting at the invitation of the new board. The atmosphere could not have been more different from the meetings I remembered. Residents asked thoughtful questions. Financial reports were reviewed openly. Infrastructure planning became a regular topic of discussion. Nobody seemed interested in assigning blame anymore. They were interested in preventing another mistake. That change mattered more to me than any payment ever could. The marina had always been part of the community. The difference was that people finally understood what that relationship actually meant. Shared benefits do not erase private ownership. Access does not create entitlement. And responsibilities do not disappear simply because they are inconvenient. A few days before Christmas, I arrived at the marina before sunrise. The harbor was quiet. Frost-covered sections of the boardwalk. Gentle waves rolled beneath the docks. The eastern horizon glowed faintly as the first light of morning approached. I walked slowly toward the south pier, the same section where those empty slips had captured everyone's attention months earlier. Several boats now occupied the spaces. New agreements were in place. New tenants had arrived. The marina was thriving again. I stopped near the end of the dock and looked out across the water. For a moment, I could almost see my father standing there beside me. He used to visit the harbor before sunrise because he believed the waterfront revealed its true character when nobody else was around. Looking across the calm lake, I finally understood what he meant. Water has a way of reflecting the truth. It reflects good decisions. It reflects bad decisions. It reflects preparation, responsibility, and neglect with equal honesty. The dispute that consumed so much of the previous year was over. The paperwork had done its job. The contracts had done their job. The infrastructure had been protected. As sunlight spread across the harbor, turning the water into a field of gold, I rested my hands on the railing and smiled. The marina remained exactly what my father built it to be. Not a symbol of power, not a source of influence, just a place where responsibility mattered. And in the end, responsibility was the one thing that never drifted away.